Pale-skinned children, some with light hair, others with gray or blue eyes, were being pulled from Georgia plantations listed as purely Negro labor estates in county ledgers. Not freed, not adopted, not recorded as births. They appeared suddenly in inventories and vanished just as quietly. This story begins in 1842, when a young county clerk in southern Georgia opened a ledger that had been sealed for 30 years and found a list of children marked not by names, but by measurements. Height, eye color, bone structure, silence. No parents listed. No origin documented. Only one repeated notation written in the same cramped hand. Transferred from Caldwell Estate. Condition acceptable. Within 6 months, the clerk would resign, leave the state, and later die in Louisiana under a different name. And Caldwell Estate? It did not appear on any map. The Caldwell Estate sat on land that locals avoided, not because of superstition, but because no one could ever remember working there. Plantation hands from neighboring counties spoke of it, as if recalling a dream. They remembered walking through its gates. They remembered the soil, dark, oily, almost bruised. They remembered children standing barefoot near the slave quarters, watching without blinking. But they never remembered leaving. Officially, the estate was established in 1811 by Reverend Thomas Caldwell, a respected Presbyterian minister sent south to civilize the frontier. His sermons still survive in church archives, obsessed not with salvation, but with inheritance, purity, and the correction of bloodlines. Caldwell preached that sin was not learned, it was bred. Behind the pulpit, behind the hymns, he purchased enslaved women not for labor, but for something described in his private letters as the refinement of flesh through guided union. This was not rape in the way history normally records it. This was systematic. Children born on Caldwell Estate were examined at birth. Most were sent south, sold, or quietly buried. But a small number, those with lighter skin, narrower noses, symmetrical faces, were kept. They were separated early, renamed, reclassified, not as family, not as slaves, but as material. Survivor accounts appeared decades later, hidden inside WPA slave narratives, always crossed out by editors. The same phrase appears again and again. The white children didn't cry. They were disciplined differently, educated privately, taught to read scripture, Latin hymns, and anatomical diagrams. They were forbidden mirrors, forbidden to touch one another, forbidden to ask questions. At night, they were led into the main house, not to sleep, but to observe. Former enslaved workers recalled Caldwell hosting gatherings with physicians, ministers, and unnamed benefactors from Charleston and Savannah. Men who spoke softly and wrote constantly. They watched the children stand under lamplight while measurements were taken. Skull width, teeth spacing, reaction to pain. One woman, interviewed in 1937, whispered something the recorder barely captured. They wasn't trying to make them white. They was trying to make them empty. By 1838, Caldwell Estate reported 0 births. Yet county death records show no increase in burials. The children were not dying. They were being moved. Across Georgia, small church-run orphanages began appearing in the 1840s, often near seminaries, always under religious protection. They accepted children without questions. They asked no origins. Their intake descriptions are chillingly similar. Male, approximate 7 years, light complexion, unusually compliant. Female, pale, quiet, unresponsive to punishment. These children were never adopted. They aged out. And when they did, they vanished into church employment, teaching positions, or clerical work, always within the institution, always controlled. Letters between ministers suggest a shared understanding that these children represented proof of something Caldwell had begun, a lineage stripped of rebellion, a human being trained from birth to submit, not through chains, but through identity erasure. By the time the Civil War approached, Caldwell Estate burned to the ground under unexplained circumstances. No bodies were found, no remains. Only the cellar survived, sealed with bricks and marked with a single carved phrase in Latin. The inheritance must not remember itself. When the Civil War reached Georgia, records burned faster than buildings. Courthouses were emptied. Church archives vanished overnight. Plantation ledgers were lost in transit. On paper, Caldwell Estate never existed. But people remembered the children. Union soldiers marching through southern counties wrote letters describing encounters they could not explain. Children with pale faces living among former slaves, who spoke like preachers and stared like animals trained not to move. One Union medic noted a boy, perhaps 10 years old, who spoke fluent Latin and refused food unless it was blessed first. When asked his name, the child said only, "I was corrected." After the war, Reconstruction officials attempted audits of church properties. Every orphanage linked, however loosely, to Caldwell's former associates claimed exemption under religious protection. No inspections occurred. Instead, the children were absorbed. Southern churches after the war were not just places of worship. They were custodial systems. Former Caldwell children were trained into roles of order: record keepers, choir leaders, catechism instructors. They spoke little of themselves. They obeyed without hesitation. Congregants described them as unsettling, not cruel, not kind. Absent. They flinched at mirrors. They avoided touch. Some could not recognize their own names unless spoken by authority. Private correspondence between bishops reveals an unspoken agreement. They are useful. They do not resist. They remember nothing of before. These churches became quiet reservoirs of something Caldwell had engineered: human beings raised without internal resistance. Not broken, hollowed. In 1879, something went wrong. A young woman known as Margaret Seda, raised in a Savannah orphanage tied to the Caldwell network, experienced what doctors described as a memory collapse. She began screaming during Sunday service. She tore pages from hymnals and cried that she could hear the cellar breathing. Margaret claimed she remembered being lined up as a child, watching others disappear through a door beneath the main house. Her journal, confiscated by clergy but later recovered, contains drawings of children without faces and a repeated sentence written dozens of times. "They made us watch so we wouldn't dream." Margaret was committed to a private asylum within weeks. She died there. The church reported it as spiritual exhaustion, but her breakdown frightened the system. After Margaret, policies changed. Former Caldwell children were no longer allowed to congregate. They were separated across counties, assigned different denominations, encouraged never to discuss childhood. Records referring to inheritance correction abruptly stopped, not because the project ended, but because it no longer needed documentation. By the 1890s, Georgia had dozens of respected ministers, teachers, and administrators with no birth records, no family lineage, and identical psychological profiles. People who followed orders instinctively. People who never asked why. And people who, when asked about their childhood, all said the same thing: "I was raised by God's house. That is all I need to remember." In 1912, a surveyor mapping land for a new railway uncovered stonework beneath red Georgia clay. It was not a foundation. It was a cellar. The bricks were fused together with a mortar mixture no one could identify, hard as bone, darkened as if burned from the inside. When workers broke through the seal, they expected debris. Instead, they found benches. Small ones, bolted to the floor. The air inside was dry, preserved, and raw. Not stale, expectant. Along the walls were iron rings, chalk markings, and faded diagrams drawn directly onto the stone. Human proportions. Children's proportions. The cellar was officially logged as pre-war storage. Then it was quietly reburied. But one man copied the markings before they disappeared. Dr. Elijah Mercer was not a historian. He was a neurologist. Mercer had been studying obedience reflexes in institutionalized patients, how identity could be suppressed through repetition, fear conditioning, and ritual. When he saw the copied cellar diagrams, he recognized something disturbing. They weren't torture instructions. They were developmental guides. Stages of emotional suppression. Eye contact elimination. Language minimization. Sleep interruption synchronized with prayer. Mercer cross-referenced the diagrams with church sermons archived across Georgia. The phrasing matched. Scripture used not for faith, but for neurological conditioning. Caldwell had not been experimenting with race. He had been experimenting with submission. Mercer began attending rural churches. He noticed patterns. Certain verses repeated at specific intervals. Call and response rhythms that induced dissociation. Children seated closest to the pulpit. He recorded one sermon in 1914. Played backward, the cadence revealed a breathing pattern used in early hypnosis. The church elders dismissed his concerns. Then Mercer discovered something worse. Baptismal records. Children entering church custody in the early 1900s with no family names, pale features, and behavioral notes identical to Caldwell-era descriptions. They were still appearing, not born on plantations, but delivered quietly through church networks, orphan trains, and charitable transfers. Caldwell estate was gone, but the method had survived. In 1918, during the influenza pandemic, a quarantined church orphanage in central Georgia collapsed into chaos. Children began screaming at night, not from illness, from dreams. Caretakers reported synchronized episodes, entire dormitories waking at once, crying that they were back in the room. One boy clawed at the floor until his fingers broke, screaming about the benches. When questioned, none could explain where the images came from. They had never been told. Dr. Mercer was denied access. 2 weeks later, the orphanage closed permanently. All children were reassigned. All records sealed. Mercer published his findings privately. The paper disappeared. So did he. By the 1920s, Georgia had changed. But something underneath it hadn't. The Caldwell experiment was no longer about creating obedient servants. It was about creating inheritors, people shaped so early, so thoroughly, that they carried the conditioning forward without instruction. Churches, schools, courts, quiet power, not domination by force, domination by design. And the most terrifying truth Mercer uncovered, scribbled in the margin of his last notebook, was this. The children were not failures of slavery. They were its evolution. In 1924, a junior federal auditor submitted a routine inquiry to Washington. It concerned missing birth certificates across 3 Georgia counties, children who appeared suddenly in church custody with no legal origin. The report was dry, procedural. It should have gone nowhere. Instead, it triggered a visit. 2 men arrived by train. They stayed 4 days. They interviewed no children. They requested no files. They attended only church services. On the 5th day, the inquiry was closed. The auditor received a transfer notice and never worked on child welfare again. In the final memo, a single sentence appeared, typed, and signed. The matter concerns spiritual jurisdiction. No federal agency ever reopened it. Historians searching for evidence of Caldwell's victims made the same assumption, that there must be bodies. There were none. Because the children were never meant to die. They were meant to continue. Caldwell's cellar was not a place of execution. It was a place of interruption, where identity was paused before it could form. Those children grew up. They married. They had families. But something was missing. Former neighbors described Caldwell descendants as polite, successful, and distant. Their homes immaculate. Their children eerily well-behaved. No tantrums. No rebellion. No memories shared at the dinner table. Beginning in the late 1800s, certain Georgia families abruptly stopped photographing their children between the ages of 5 and 10. Albums skip years. Baby portraits. Then nothing. Then adulthood. When asked why, descendants offered vague explanations. Fires, floods, lost albums. But archivists noticed a pattern. The missing years aligned exactly with known Caldwell conditioning ages. One elderly woman, when shown a childhood photograph she had never seen before, began shaking and said, "They told us not to look at ourselves too long. We might recognize who we used to be." By the 1930s, Caldwell's original language had vanished from records, but the effects remained. Entire communities shaped by people who had learned obedience before language. People who confused authority with safety. People who passed silence down as virtue. This was not conspiracy. It was culture. A design that no longer needed a cellar. Only repetition. Only institutions. Only time. In 1936, a church archivist found a bundle of letters hidden behind a false wall. Caldwell's handwriting. One sentence, underlined 3 times, stood out. If the child never knows themselves, they will never resist what they are told they are. The archivist burned the letters that night. Not out of fear, out of recognition. The final documented appearance of a Caldwell pattern child occurred in 1948. A boy, approximately 9 years old, was delivered to a rural Georgia church following the closure of a private orphanage. No name, no birth certificate, no history. The intake form listed only 3 observations. Unusually calm, avoids mirrors, responds immediately to instruction. The pastor noted that the boy did not ask where he was. He asked who he belonged to. The church renamed him, educated him, integrated him quietly into congregational life. By adulthood, he would become a teacher. No complaints were ever filed. No crimes committed. No scandals attached. He lived an unremarkable life. And that was the point. By 1950, the language of Caldwell had dissolved completely. No more sermons about inheritance. No more cellar diagrams. No more orphanages without records. Only patterns. Communities where silence was mistaken for virtue. Families where obedience replaced intimacy. Children taught to listen before they learned to feel. Historians searching for villains failed because the system no longer needed them. Caldwell did not leave behind a cult. He left behind a method. And methods do not require belief, only repetition. In interviews conducted decades later, descendants of affected families described the same sensation. A feeling of distance from their own childhoods. Gaps in memory with no trauma attached. A reflexive fear of authority paired with loyalty to it. Nothing dramatic. Nothing prosecutable. Just absence. One psychologist summarized it best. The most successful control systems do not hurt people. They convince people they were never hurt at all. Even today, some rural churches in Georgia keep their basements locked. Not because there is anything inside, but because there used to be. Caretakers will tell you the locks are old, the keys misplaced, the rooms unsafe. They will not tell you what children used to sit there. They will not tell you why the benches were bolted down. And they will never tell you why some congregations still avoid mirrors in certain rooms. This story did not vanish because it was erased. It vanished because it worked. There were no mass graves, no missing populations, no rebellion. Only people who grew up believing that silence was natural, that authority was protection, that obedience was identity. History remembers violence. It forgets design. If a child is shaped before they can remember, if obedience is taught before language, if identity is interrupted before it forms, at what point does freedom even begin? And how would you know if it never did? Some secrets are not buried. They are raised. They attend church. They teach school. They pass quietly through generations. And they never ask where they came from. Because they were taught, very early, not to remember,